The morning over the Ardennes was the kind of cold that silenced everything. Frost clung to tree trunks like a second skin, and every branch sagged beneath a thin, unforgiving weight of ice. The sky was a sheet of dull metal, the colour of old gun barrels, pressing low over the forest. The men of the 327th Glider Infantry moved like ghosts through the snow, their uniforms stiff, their eyes dulled by exhaustion and hunger. Among them, Sergeant Thomas Miller stood hunched beside a battered SCR 300 field radio, its antenna quivering in the wind. The machine crackled uselessly, vomiting static, the same tortured noise that had haunted them for days. No one had slept. No one dared to. The Germans had blanketed every known frequency with interference, drowning Allied transmissions beneath a tide of sound that felt like madness. Orders, supply calls, even the simple human comfort of a voice from headquarters. Everything was gone, swallowed by that unending hiss. Miller's breath rose and vanished like a ghost of itself. His gloves were stiff with oil and blood. His fingers had lost all feeling. Around him, men murmured under their breath, some in prayer, some in delirium. They had fought through the night and were clinging to a patch of frozen earth that barely qualified as ground. Mud turned to glass by the cold, littered with brass casings and the broken remains of men. Each sound, each breath, carried the weight of being overheard by something unseen. Fear had a rhythm here, slow and constant, like a heartbeat waiting to stop. A few feet away, Private Daniel Carter knelt beside the radio equipment, a boy more than a soldier. His face was cracked with cold burns, lips split and bleeding. He had been working for hours, checking circuits, swapping tubes, tightening wires in the futile hope that one more adjustment might pierce through the wall of static. The other men didn't pay him much attention. No one believed that machine could save them, but Carter wasn't ready to give up. He believed in the small things, the hum of electricity, the way metal conducted prayer better than flesh, the idea that maybe, just maybe, if you changed one wrong thing, the universe might listen. He reached for the feed wires again, hands shaking. One red, one black. Standard procedure drilled into every comms man since basic training. Red to post, black to ground. But Carter's mind was fading. Fatigue blurred everything into instinct and guesswork. He swapped them, black to chassis, red to ground. A reversal so small it might have gone unnoticed if Miller hadn't turned just then, his tired eyes catching the motion. "What the hell are you doing?" Miller's voice came out low and rough, half a growl, half a warning. Carter froze. For a moment, he thought he'd ruined everything. Then, as his gloved hand brushed the side of the radio, the static stopped. Not faded, stopped. The air went hollow. Even the wind seemed to retreat. And in that silence, as men turned one by one to look at the quiet machine, a voice broke through, clear, calm, and impossibly distant. Headquarters, the coordinates, the call sign, every word perfectly shaped, untouched by noise. No one spoke for several seconds. They just stared at the box as if it had conjured a ghost. Miller's cigarette trembled in his mouth. One of the privates crossed himself. Another let out a laugh that cracked mid-breath, too afraid it might vanish if he believed it. Carter's eyes were wide, reflecting the tiny orange glow of the vacuum tubes inside the radio. He didn't understand what he'd done. None of them did. But for the first time in days, their words reached beyond the forest. What Carter's clumsy hands had done, that simple reversal of wires, had shifted the harmonics of their transmission just below the range of German intercept. Their voices now travelled under the noise, invisible, unheard by the enemy's scanners. It was as if the war had turned its back for a second and let them speak freely. They were no longer blind. They were no longer lost. Word spread fast among the unit. Officers called it luck. The radio men called it a fluke. But among the men freezing in foxholes, it felt like a miracle, raw and undeserved. Miller didn't lecture Carter. He didn't thank him either. He just gave him a look, a quiet acknowledgement between two people who'd accidentally outwitted death for a moment. Around them, the battle kept roaring on, shells screaming in the distance, trees shattering like glass. But the radio kept humming steady. For those brief hours, it was the sound of hope disguised as static. And that's how an idiotic mistake saved an entire line of men from being swallowed by silence. Sometimes fate doesn't arrive with thunder or light. It hums through copper, flickers through frost, and chooses the hands of a boy too tired to think straight. If you're watching this right now, leave a quick comment. Tell me where you're seeing this story from today. For the next few hours after that impossible transmission, the forest seemed to breathe differently. The men didn't talk much, but something had shifted in the way they moved. The hopeless slack that had hung over them since the German jammers began their assault seemed to loosen, replaced by a quiet, stubborn pulse of belief. It wasn't loud, not the kind of morale a commander could measure on paper, but it was alive, like a buried ember that refused to die out. The radio that had once been a useless box of static now sat in the center of their small circle of tents, glowing faintly in the frozen air, its tubes pulsing like a heartbeat. Miller checked it every few minutes, not out of distrust, but because it felt unreal. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a reminder that the universe hadn't completely abandoned them. Carter, though, couldn't shake the feeling that he'd cheated something. He sat on an ammo crate near the set, staring at the snow, his hands trembling from exhaustion and the dull ache of guilt. He hadn't meant to fix anything. It was a mistake, pure and simple. The kind of slip that got men yelled at, sometimes even court-martialed. Yet that mistake had given life to their comms again, and now superiors were asking for the wiring schematic, for the procedure he'd followed. He didn't have the words to explain that there was no procedure, that it was just blind chance. Miller told him to keep his mouth shut and play along until someone higher up decided what to call it. But deep down, Miller knew the truth. The line between stupidity and genius in war was thinner than a single strand of copper. By dawn, the message from headquarters had arrived. Reinforcements were moving. Supply trucks were pushing through frozen roads to their coordinates. They weren't forgotten. The men didn't cheer. There was no energy left for celebration. But there was movement again, a purpose returning to their eyes. They cleaned their weapon, whispered jokes over coffee that tasted like rust, and began digging new positions with the confidence of men who believed someone out there was listening. The radio operator from another company trudged through the snow just to see Carter's setup. He stood there in disbelief, watching the signal hold steady, pure and untouched, while his own set just a few miles away still screamed with interference. He asked for instructions, diagram, anything. Carter hesitated before showing him the reversed wires. The man blinked, confused, then laughed like he didn't quite believe it. "That's it?" he said. Carter nodded slowly. That was it. In the days that followed, word spread quietly across the sector. Technicians whispered about the Bastogne bypass, a rumor that some unit out there had found a way around the German jamming net. No one quite believed it, but the thought alone was enough to keep spirits afloat. Radios were sacred in that kind of. They carried not just orders, but lives, hope, the last words of men dying far from home. Losing a signal was like being cut off from the world, erased. Gaining it back, even through a mistake, was like being reborn. At night, when the shelling paused and the forest fell still, Carter would sit near the set and listen to the hum. It sounded almost like a voice beneath the noise, something human, something alive. Sometimes he imagined it was his brother, who'd gone missing in France the year before, calling from somewhere beyond the static. Miller watched him quietly, not saying anything. He understood that look, the need to believe that something greater was watching over them, even if it came through a tangle of wires and frost. The engineers who finally arrived to inspect the system tried to replicate the error. They rewired, measured, recalibrated, all under Miller's weary eyes. Every test came back the same. When the wires were swapped, the radio worked like nothing else in the field. They didn't fully understand why. Some said it changed the phase of the signal. Others said it altered the grounding pattern, creating a kind of harmonic cloak. But none of that mattered to the men who'd lived it. They didn't care about science or theory. To them, it was a miracle, born from desperation. On the third night, the snow stopped falling, and a faint orange dawn crept through the haze. The forest was quiet except for the steady hum of that one radio, still carrying voices through the air unseen by enemy ear. Miller took a long look at Carter, who was finally asleep beside the set, his face soft and pale under the dull glow. The sergeant smiled faintly. He knew history wouldn't remember the boy's name. It never did. The reports would probably credit the success to innovative field adaptation or technical improvisation under combat conditions. But Miller would remember the truth, that salvation had come not from brilliance, but from accident, from exhaustion, from the shaking hands of a kid who refused to give up even when the world told him to. As the first transport trucks rolled in later that week, carrying food, fuel, and hope, Miller stood over the radio one last time, listening to the steady rhythm of it. He realized that in war, sometimes the smallest human error could sound a lot like grace. If you feel that, if you understand what it means to find light in chaos, don't just pass by. Hit that subscribe button, because some stories deserve to be heard all the way through. The snow returned that night with a vengeance, It fell sideways, slashing through the air in long, vicious streaks, driven by a wind that howled across the tree line like the voices of the dead. The Ardennes were burning beneath the white, a strange, cruel paradox where fire and frost existed together, locked in some unholy marriage. The German guns started before dawn, rumbling deep from the woods to the east, pounding the ground until the frozen earth shook like a drum. Shells burst in orange light, cutting the darkness into violent flashes. The 327th huddled in their foxhole, buried under layers of ice and fear. The radio, Carter's radio, was alive with voices, dozens of them, coordinating artillery, relaying troop movements, screaming for medics, calling for air support that could barely fly through the storm. It was the heart of their world now, that little box of copper and tubes. And somehow, miraculously, it never faltered. The invisible channel that Carter had created, the one that slipped beneath the German scanners, carried every word clean and strong through the chaos. Miller barked orders over the sound of impact after impact. He was a man made for this, born from the smoke and thunder. His voice never broke. "Hold the line! No one pulls back!" He turned to the radio, grabbing the handset, yelling coordinates, while Carter scribbled them down and tuned the dials with mechanical precision. The boy was calm in a way that made no sense, his hands steady even as explosions tore the forest apart around them. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe he'd gone beyond fear. There's a point in war where the mind simply stops resisting and becomes part of the machine, moving through instinct alone. The Germans were trying to cut through Bastogne's northern route. Their tanks, the Panthers, crawled through the snow like iron beasts, engines growling under the weight of ice. The Americans were outnumbered and undersupplied, barely holding the perimeter. Every few minutes the radio would erupt with overlapping voices, shouting, pleading, swearing, and then Miller's calm tone would slice through them, clear and firm, calling out for artillery fire from units they couldn't even see. "Fire mission, grid 2843, incoming armor, repeat." The transmission crackled, faded, then returned crystal clear. The interference couldn't touch them. The mistake still held. At one point, a shell landed so close that the world went white. Carter was thrown backward, ears ringing, snow and dirt falling over him like rain. When he blinked through the haze, he saw Miller dragging him by the collar, shouting something he couldn't hear. The radio had been knocked on its side, sparks leaping from the side panel. Carter lunged toward it, shielding it with his body as if it were a living thing. He worked fast, tightening connections with shaking hands, patching the wires with his teeth when he had to. The moment the hum came back, that steady, fragile hum, he almost cried. It was as if the universe had coughed, staggered, then remembered its duty to keep breathing. Above them, thunder rolled. Planes, American planes, had broken through the cloud line, guided by coordinates relayed through that same signal. They came roaring overhead, P-47s diving low, their machine guns spitting light into the snowstorm. The earth shook under their fury. German armor erupted in flames, the fire lighting up the falling snow like sparks against velvet. The men in the foxholes cheered, wild and disbelieving. "That's our air boys! That's our damn angels!" someone shouted. Miller didn't smile. He just looked at Carter, both of them knowing that none of it would have happened if not for two wires swapped in exhaustion. For the first time since the siege began, they had the upper hand. HQ could see them, hear them. Command had a clear line again, invisible to the enemy, perfect in its strange simplicity. It was chaos made beautiful, a storm of steel and light moving in harmony because of one broken rule, one stupid perfect accident. But miracles in war don't last forever. By late afternoon, as the bombing runs ended and the survivors regrouped, Miller's earpiece started to hum again, faint, subtle, but different this time. Not static, something else. A pulse. A foreign rhythm, like breathing through metal. The Germans were adapting. Somewhere out there, in a bunker buried beneath the snow, a team of enemy operators had begun sweeping for unknown frequencies. They'd heard the whispers. The dead American channels weren't dead anymore, and now the hunters were listening. Miller caught Carter's eye. Neither of them spoke. They just knew. Whatever they'd discovered, whatever luck had shielded them, was about to be tested. The forest around them burned slow and low, embers glowing under the falling snow like dying stars. Men limped through the smoke, some laughing in disbelief, some crying quietly. Above them, the sky had opened in streaks of fading light, the last hint of day struggling to survive the darkness creeping in. Carter sat beside the radio again, the hum steady in his ears, the glow painting his face orange. He was no longer a boy, not after what he'd seen that day. He looked at his reflection in the metal casing and didn't recognize the man staring back. And somewhere in the distance, through that fragile line of sound, the enemy began to whisper back. Night came hard, pressing down like a weight. The wind screamed through the trees, turning the forest into a living thing that moaned and hissed with every shell that fell in the distance. The men of the 327th moved like shadows, patching wounds, checking ammo, feeding fires that barely stayed alive in the cold. Over everything hung that radio hum, steady, stubborn, alive, the sound of a heartbeat that refused to quit. Then, slowly, it changed. Carter noticed first, a faint echo behind their transmissions, a thin ghost of sound that shouldn't have been there. Every time he keyed the mic, a breath came back through the line, not static, not feedback, something else, a listener. He looked up at Miller, eyes wide. The sergeant leaned closer, listening, his jaw tightening. He didn't need words. They both knew. The Germans had found them. By midnight, the air was thick with invisible war. The enemy had unleashed a new kind of interference, short bursts that mimicked their own voices, sliced into their channel like knives, repeating their coordinates in broken English, false commands, traps. The frequency that had saved them was now a battlefield of its own. Carter fought the dial with frozen fingers, adjusting, counter-tuning, whispering to the machine as if begging it to stay with him. Every turn of the knob changed the pitch of the world. Gunfire fading, screams returning, silence breaking again. Outside, flares lit the snow in pulses of red and white. Shapes moved between the trees. Scouts, ghosts, maybe both. Miller crouched beside the radio, shouting new coordinates to artillery units still trusting their signal. The Germans were listening, twisting his words, sending back their own versions seconds later. Confusion spread across the line like infection. Hold your fire. No. Fire. Grid confirmed. Grid false. Voices layered over voices until no one knew which was real. Miller ripped the headset off, slammed it against the crate, then forced it back on. We hold the signal, he muttered through his teeth. We don't let them take it. Carter stared at the dials, mind racing. He remembered the first accident, the wire swap had hidden them, and realized that the same logic might save them again. Interference wasn't the enemy. Predictability was. He reached into the back panel, ignoring the sparks that snapped against his skin, and twisted the tuning crystal 3 degrees off its axis. The hum wavered, faltered, then steadied again, lower, deeper, almost subsonic. The German voices vanished, silent. Then HQ came through, faint but pure. Signal Bastogne, status clear, we read you. Miller exhaled for the first time in hours. Around them, the guns outside kept roaring, but something in the air had shifted again. Their voices were free. The counter-tuning had worked. They were invisible once more, but it came at a cost. The frequency that hid them also trapped them. They could transmit, but not receive clearly beyond short bursts. They were shouting into the dark, hoping someone still heard. Carter slumped against the frozen dirt, chest heaving, blood dripping from his fingertips where the current had kissed him. Miller pulled off his gloves and wrapped the kid's hands in a strip of torn cloth. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. Hours passed like years. The forest smoldered, the snow turning grey with ash. Men came and went from the command pit, eyes hollow, mouths cracked from thirst. The radio kept humming, that low, stubborn sound that had become their companion. In war, silence meant death. Noise, even broken, ghostly noise, meant life. When dawn finally came, it revealed what the night had done. Trees splintered into black spears, a dozen men gone. The ground itself seemed to smoke. Yet in the middle of it, the radio still glowed, a small, defiant sun refusing to die. Miller looked at Carter and asked quietly, "You think they'll ever know what you did?" Carter shook his head. "Doesn't matter if they do." The sergeant nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon where new snow was already falling. "Maybe not, but they'll live because of it." Then he turned back to the radio and keyed the mic, his voice calm again, steady over the ruins of the night. "Bastogne line active. We're still here." The air answered with the faintest crackle. Not enemy, not static, just a whisper of acknowledgement. It was enough. If you were standing there, listening to that impossible sound, the hum that meant survival, what would you have felt? Tell me in the comments below. Write exactly this. I would have held the signal. The snow finally stopped. For the first time in weeks, the sky wasn't an endless grey wall pressing down on them. It had softened into something fragile, almost blue, with the faintest burn of sunlight trying to exist again. The forest looked like a graveyard painted in glass. Frozen smoke clung to the treetops, and beneath it, the ground was littered with the relics of survival. Helmets half buried, rifles stuck in the ice like markers for the dead, and the faint smell of burnt oil carried by the wind. The guns had gone quiet, but the silence they left behind was heavier than the noise had ever been. Sergeant Miller walked among the remnants with a kind of stillness that didn't belong to the living. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if the earth might crack beneath him. Around him, the survivors of the 327th Glider Infantry were digging shallow graves, marking names they didn't always know. Their gloves were stiff with blood, and their eyes had forgotten how to close all the way. The radio still sat where it always had, half buried in the corner of their command pit, humming softly, its tubes glowing like embers in a dying fire. Carter was sitting beside it, staring at the horizon. He hadn't spoken much since the night of the counter-jamming. The tips of his fingers were wrapped in layers of dirty cloth, his nails black from burns, but his hands never stopped moving, tightening, adjusting, cleaning the set like it was the only thing keeping him connected to something real. Miller stopped beside him. He didn't say anything for a long time. The boy looked older now, hollow-eyed, face drawn tight like the skin of an old drum. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "You ever wonder if the signal's still ours?" Miller frowned. "What do you mean?" Carter kept his gaze on the faint light of the tubes. "We've been transmitting for days. We don't even know who's listening anymore. Could be command, could be them, could be nobody." He turned slightly, his breath fogging in the cold. "Feels like we're just talking to ghosts." Miller didn't answer. The thought had crossed his mind too. After what they'd been through, the jamming, the phantom echoes, the enemy whispering back, it was hard to believe the air itself hadn't gone mad. But the radio still worked, and that was all that mattered. "Doesn't matter who hears," he said finally. "We keep sending. That's the job." The boy nodded, but there was no conviction in it. He went back to his adjustments, hands steady, despite everything. Miller turned his eyes toward the horizon, where the smoke of the previous night's bombardment drifted lazily over the tree line. He thought about the men buried out there, frozen under shallow dirt that would thaw by spring. Every one of them had once believed they were untouchable, part of something larger than themselves. Now they were stories no one would tell. Later that afternoon, a small convoy from headquarters finally broke through the roads. Trucks dragging through ice, bringing fuel, food, and a handful of engineers sent to study the Bastogne anomaly, as they were calling it now. They were clean, well-fed, untouched by the madness of the front. They shook Miller's hand, nodded to Carter, and then went straight to work examining the radio like archaeologists uncovering some divine relic. They spoke in quick, clipped tones, measuring, sketching, discussing signal harmonics and frequency bleed. Carter stood by in silence, watching strangers take apart the thing that had saved them. Miller noticed the look on his face, part anger, part sadness, and he understood. The war had a way of turning miracles into reports, names into statistics, human stories into notes in someone's file. When the engineers left, promising commendations and recognition that would never actually reach the front, the boy didn't move for hours. The radio was silent now, dismantled and packed into a crate like a corpse. The hum was gone. The air felt empty. That night, Miller sat beside him, sharing a cigarette. Neither spoke for a long time. The forest was quiet except for the faint hiss of wind moving through broken trees. "You did good, son," Miller said at last, voice rough. "You saved more men than you'll ever know." Carter shook his head slowly. "I just got lucky." Miller exhaled, the smoke catching the last bit of fading light. "Luck doesn't fix radio. Luck doesn't hold a signal under fire. You did that." The boy gave a tired half smile. "You really think they'll remember that?" Miller didn't answer right away. He looked up at the stars, faint and cold, and thought about how memory worked in war. The generals remembered victories. The soldiers remembered faces. The world remembered neither. "No," he said finally. "But maybe they'll feel it. Somewhere down the line, some kid will talk on a clear channel and not know why. Maybe that'll be enough." Carter nodded, eyes distant. He understood. You didn't fight for glory out here. You fought to exist, to be a small part of something that might last longer than the noise. Days turned into weeks. The siege began to lift. Planes started flying overhead more often, dropping supplies, carrying news that the line had held. The men joked again. They smiled sometime. The frozen ground began to soften, and with it came the smell of life, trying to crawl back into the soil. Miller found himself watching Carter often, the way he kept checking the sky, the way his hands twitched when he didn't have wires. It wasn't nerves, it was habit, the residue of survival. When a man spends too long listening for signals, silence becomes unbearable. On one of the last mornings before they were rotated out, Miller caught Carter sitting alone with the new radio set, a pristine factory-issue model, untouched by frost or fire. It was clean, efficient, lifeless. He was staring at it like a stranger. "They want you to train the next group," Miller said from behind. Carter didn't turn. "I don't think I can." "Why not?" He sighed. "Because they'll want me to teach them how it's supposed to be done. And the truth is, nothing about that was supposed to work. It shouldn't have. We only survived because I got it wrong." Miller stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe that's the lesson then." Carter finally looked up, eyes red from sleeplessness. "That the best things in war happen by mistake." "No," Miller said quietly. "That sometimes the only way to beat chaos is to be part of it." For a long while, they just stood there in the pale morning light, the hum of the new set faint but steady. The war was still raging somewhere beyond the horizon, but here, in this small patch of earth, there was peace. Thin, fragile, temporary, but peace nonetheless. When orders finally came for their withdrawal, the men packed what was left of their camp. Carter took one last look at the frozen clearing, where the first miracle had happened, where two wires had crossed and changed the course of their lives. The snow had melted there faster than anywhere else, as if the ground itself had remembered the warmth they'd done. He crouched, brushed his hand across the soil, and whispered something Miller didn't catch. Then he stood, shouldering his pack, the faint light of dawn reflecting in his eyes. As the convoy rumbled away, Miller glanced back at the field one last time. The forest seemed to glow faintly under the rising sun, smoke twisting up like breath. Somewhere behind them, buried under frost and mud, was the place where luck had met desperation, where error had become salvation. And though no one else would ever know its story, it would live on in the men who did. Carter leaned his head against the side of the truck, eyes closing as they drove. The sound of the engine merged with the faint echo of a radio hum that lived in his memory. He wasn't listening for orders anymore. He was listening for proof that they had mattered, that their voices, once invisible to the enemy, still lingered somewhere in the... As the road curved out of Bastogne, the last transmission they ever sent played in Miller's mind. His own voice, calm and steady, carried across the air like a promise. Bastogne line active. "We're still here." And they were. Even when the world forgot their names, even when the signal finally faded. If this story reached you, if you can feel what it means to fight not for glory, but for connection, then don't just scroll away. Like, share, subscribe, because some voices, no matter how faint, deserve to be heard again. When the war finally moved east, and the roar of artillery became a faraway echo, Miller discovered that silence could be its own kind of battlefield. It wasn't peace that came after Bastogne. It was vacancy, a hollow stillness that made men restless, because they no longer had anything left to defy. The company was scattered across a patchwork of temporary camps in northern France, repairing roads and guarding bridges that no one was trying to destroy anymore. The snow had melted into rivers of brown water that carried away the traces of what had been. Miller walked those roads every morning. His boots sank in the mud, his breath visible in the dawn. He carried no weapon now, only a field notebook that he filled with things he couldn't say out loud. Lists of names, fragments of coordinates, sentences that always ended halfway through. Sometimes he wrote about the boy with the burned hands, sometimes about the sound of the radio hum that still lived somewhere in his ears. He wrote not to remember, but to prove to himself that it had really happened. Carter was gone. After the engineers had finished dissecting his improvised miracle, they'd reassigned him to a communications unit near the Rhine. Miller never saw him leave, just woke one morning to find his bunk empty, his toolbox closed, and a folded scrap of paper sitting on the radio. "Keep the signal alive." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The men who'd survived the siege moved differently now. They laughed too loud, ate too fast, slept with their hands curled as if still gripping a rifle. When trucks backfired in the yard, half of them hit the dirt before realizing it was just noise. The officers called them heroes, but Miller could see that most of them didn't feel heroic. They felt unfinished, like parts of themselves were still buried in that frozen forest. One evening, while the rest of the camp was drinking, Miller found himself drawn to the communications tent. The place smelled of ozone and dust. Rows of clean, new radios lined the tables, perfect machines untouched by weather or blood. He ran his fingers over one of them, remembering the warmth of the old SCR 300, the faint vibration it made under Carter's hands, the way its hum had sounded almost alive. These new ones were silent until you turned them on. They waited, obedient, without memory. He hesitated before flipping the switch. The tubes glowed faintly, a pale orange heart inside the metal. Static filled the room, a soft hiss, like the sea inside a shell. Miller adjusted the dial, moving through the frequencies. Music drifted in, then voices in French, then German, then nothing but the long sigh of the ether. For a moment he could almost believe he heard it again. The old signal, hidden under the noise, the one that had carried them through the fire. He whispered into the mic without thinking. "Bastogne line active. Do you copy?" Nothing. Just the sound of wind across a dead channel. He smiled bitterly and shut it off. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Weeks passed. The war wound itself tighter toward its end, and with each day, the camp grew emptier. Men were rotated home, their faces a mixture of relief and fear of what awaited them beyond the ocean. Miller stayed on, partly by choice, partly because he didn't know what else to be. He'd been a soldier for too long. The idea of existing in quiet rooms with clocks and newspapers seemed unreal. He didn't miss the fighting. He missed the certainty of it, the way every second carried weight. One night, a letter arrived, postmarked from somewhere near Cologne. The handwriting was clumsy but familiar. "Carter." The message was short. "Still listening. Frequency holds. Stay safe, Sarge." Nothing else. No signature, no address to reply to. Miller read it until the ink began to smudge under his thumb. He kept the letter in his breast pocket for the rest of the war. When Germany finally surrendered, the celebrations reached even the small towns where no shots had been fired in months. Men shouted, church bells rang, wine bottles shattered against tanks that would never move again. Miller watched it all from the edge of a bridge and felt nothing. He wanted to feel joy, but all he could think about was the sound of that radio in the snow, the moment when one man's exhaustion had turned into a miracle. He went home in late autumn. The train dropped him in Ohio, under a sky that looked too clean. The air smelled of leaves, not cordite. His wife met him at the station with a trembling smile. His son, who had learned to walk while he was away, hid behind her skirt and peeked at the stranger in uniform. For weeks, Miller tried to fit into that quiet life. He fixed the roof, painted the fence, went to church, laughed when people expected him to laugh. But at night, he would sit on the porch with a radio beside him, tuning through stations long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. He wasn't looking for news. He was listening for that hum. Sometimes, when the air was heavy with summer heat and the static grew dense, he swore he could hear it, a faint pulse under the chatter, the ghost of a signal still alive, somewhere across the ocean. He would lean closer, heart racing like he was back in the forest, and whisper, "You copy, kid." There was never an answer, only the whisper of air moving through old circuits. Yet each time he heard it, he smiled. Years slipped by. The war became stories in books, grainy photographs in shop windows, medals framed behind glass. People began to speak of victory as if it had been inevitable. No one mentioned the nights when every voice on the radio had gone silent. No one remembered the mistake that had saved them, but Miller did. He kept a box in his attic filled with relics from Bastogne, a rusted mess kit, a torn map, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a small coil of red and black wire. He grew older, slower. His hands began to shake when he tried to write, so he recorded his thoughts instead. He'd sit by the window with a small tape machine and talk into the microphone, his voice calm, patient, the way he used to sound when giving orders. "We didn't win because we were stronger," he would say softly. "We won because someone got tired and didn't follow the rules, because one kid thought he was making a mistake." He never played the tapes for anyone. He just let them pile up like messages waiting for a receiver that might never exist. Then, one winter evening, decades after the guns had gone quiet, a letter arrived from an address he didn't recognize. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting shaky. "Sergeant Miller," it began. "I hope this reaches you. The doctors say my hearing's going, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the hum. I think it's ours. Thought you should know." It was signed simply Carter. Miller read it 3 times, then set it down beside the radio on his desk. Outside, the wind was rising again, howling through the trees like it had that night in the Ardennes. He turned the dial slowly, searching through the static, and for a heartbeat, just one, he thought he heard another voice breathing through the noise. He leaned close, whispered the same words he had spoken half a lifetime ago. "Bastogne line active, we're still here." And maybe, somewhere, someone answered. Because sometimes the past doesn't disappear, it drifts, waiting for the right frequency, the right pair of hands, the right mistake to bring it back. Miller sat there until dawn. the glow of the tubes painting his face in soft amber. The hum filled the room like a memory of warmth. He smiled, not as a soldier or survivor, but as a man who finally understood what that sound had meant. It wasn't luck. It wasn't fate. It was proof that even in the worst darkness, connection endures, that two voices once joined can echo forever if you just keep listening. The house was old now. The floorboards creaked when he walked across them, and the smell of dust mixed with the faint trace of oil that lingered from the small radio workshop he kept in the back room. Miller's hair had gone white, his hands spotted and lined, but the strength in his fingers was still there, the kind that came from years of turning bolts and tuning knobs. He rarely left the house anymore. The world outside had grown too fast, too loud, too full of noise that carried no meaning. Television, telephones, cars that hummed instead of roared, they all filled the air with the kind of static he could never quite tune out. He spent most of his days by the window, the same radio always beside him. It wasn't the one from Bastogne, but a rebuilt version, assembled from pieces he had gathered over decades. To anyone else, it looked like a relic. To him, it was a living thing. Each tube glowed with a pulse that reminded him of breathing. Every evening, he'd sit there and listen, drifting through frequencies, catching fragments of distant stations that faded in and out like ghosts. He didn't care about the words. He listened for the hum beneath them, the steady undertone that once carried a miracle. Some nights, he'd hear it, soft, low, buried under the static. It wasn't a station, not music or speech, just that faint vibration that seemed to come from nowhere. He would lean closer, eyes half closed, and whisper the same words he had spoken in the frozen forest all those years ago. Bastogne line active, we're still here. He didn't expect an answer. He just liked to say it, like a prayer for the ones who didn't come back. One winter evening, when the snow began to fall again outside his window, he decided to record a message, something that might outlast him. The tape machine was an old model from the 50s, heavy and solid, the kind built by men who believed machines should have souls. He pressed the red button and waited for the faint click that meant it was listening. This is Sergeant Thomas Miller, United States Army, 327th Glider Infantry, he began, voice steady but soft. It's been a long time since Bastogne, longer than I ever thought I'd live to see. He paused, smiling faintly at the absurdity of talking to an empty room. I don't know who'll ever hear this. Maybe no one. Maybe some kid, 50 years from now, playing with an old radio will catch it by accident. Doesn't matter. What matters is that the signal stays alive. He took a breath, the kind of breath a man takes when the past sits heavy on his chest. We used to think the war was about winning, about flags and ground and who was left standing. But I learned something different out there. It's not the bullets or the medals that stay with you. It's the sound of another voice cutting through the noise when you thought you were alone. He leaned back, eyes on the falling snow. There was a kid, Private Daniel Carter. He was the reason we made it through. He didn't mean to be. He thought he'd made a mistake. But that's the thing about miracles. They don't look like they're supposed to. They look like accidents. They sound like static. And sometimes they come from hands too young to know they're changing the world. Miller let the silence stretch, the only sound the soft whir of the tape reel turning. If you're hearing this, he said finally, then remember, every connection matters. Every small thing you do can save someone, even if you never know it. And when the noise gets too loud, just keep listening. There's always a signal underneath it. He stopped the recording, sat there a while staring at the machine, then rewound the tape and played it back. His own voice filled the room, older, rougher, but still carrying that steady rhythm he once used on the radio. For a moment, he felt young again. The room seemed to fade, replaced by snow, by smoke, by the glow of vacuum tubes under a frozen tarp. When the recording ended, he didn't rewind it again. He labeled the tape carefully, Bastogne line, and placed it in a small wooden box beside the folded American flag that had come home with him. Then he turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, the faint glow of the radio washing his face in amber light. Outside, the storm was growing stronger. Snow drifted against the glass in slow spirals. Miller closed his eye and listened. Somewhere out there, hidden in the static of 1,000 modern voices, the hum was still there. The same sound that had saved them, the same whisper that connected one life to another. And for the first time in years, he thought he heard something new. A reply, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Copy that, Sard. He didn't open his eye. He just smiled. The smile stayed on his face long after the hum faded. He didn't question what he'd heard, didn't wonder whether it had been real, or memory, or something stranger. Some things in life weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be felt. The old man leaned back in his chair, the glow from the radio flickering across his features, and he let his eyes wander across the room. Every wall was lined with quiet relics of a life spent waiting for the next sound. Photographs of men long gone, yellowing field maps, coils of wire carefully coiled in jars, a lifetime built around connection. The snow outside fell heavier now, blanketing the world in silence. Each flake caught the faint orange light of his window before disappearing into the darkness. Somewhere out there, across continents and oceans, signals were bouncing between towers and satellites, carrying the chatter of a world that no longer remembered what it had once been like to whisper through fear. Miller thought about how easy how voices travelled instantly, how silence had become a choice instead of a burden. And yet, despite all that progress, he wondered if the world still listened the way they had to. If people still heard the difference between noise and a human voice. He turned the dial again, slowly, carefully. The frequencies shifted like waves. For a few seconds, he caught the faint sound of a modern broadcast, a young announcer talking about weather and traffic. Then, below it, barely audible, came a low vibration that made his chest tighten. He didn't recognize it, but it felt familiar in the bones. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Stay with it, don't lose the signal." Outside, the storm howled, wind scraping against the windows like the edge of a memory. The house seemed to breathe with him, its old frame groaning under the cold. For a moment, time folded, the present fading into the past bleeding into the now. He could smell the iron scent of snow and gunpowder, hear the distant rumble of artillery, see Carter hunched over the radio, his hands trembling, his eyes burning with the quiet fire of purpose. The forest was alive again in his mind, the frozen air, the breath of men who refused to die, the hum that defied death itself. Then it was gone. Just his living room, the storm, and the steady heartbeat of the radio. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, and crossed the room to the cabinet where he kept his keepsake. He took out the small box labeled WWII and opened it. Inside were only three things: the tape he'd recorded, the folded letter from Carter, and the twisted red and black wire they'd pulled from the old set decades ago. The insulation had cracked with age, but the metal inside still gleamed faintly. He held it up to the light and smiled. "You did good, son," he murmured. When he put it back, he hesitated. Then, with careful fingers, he added a slip of paper to the box, a note in his shaky handwriting that read, "If you find this, listen first. Then, believe." He closed the lid and left it there, not as a monument, but as a message meant for whoever came after. That night, as he sat once more by the window, the storm began to ease. The clouds broke, revealing a strip of sky streaked with faint stars. The wind softened, and for the first time in days, he could hear the world breathe again. Miller looked out across the white fields, his mind drifting to all the men whose voices had filled the ether during those desperate nights in the Ardennes, voices that had risen, fallen, and vanished into the static. Maybe, he thought, they were all still out there somewhere, carried endlessly on invisible waves, waiting to be heard again. He leaned toward the radio, turned the volume low, and said softly, "We're still here." Then he left it on, the hum filling the house as he dozed off in his chair. When morning came, the sunlight poured through the window, turning the frost on the glass into a million tiny sparks. The radio was still on, humming faintly. The tape recorder beside it had stopped, its reel full. And on the tape, beneath the hiss of static and the long, steady silence, a faint voice could be heard, barely more than a whisper. "Copy that, Sarge." The signal lived on. Years later, when a young historian bought the old house and found the wooden box tucked in the cabinet, she didn't understand what she'd uncovered. The tape was labeled WWII, and when she played it, the room filled with the soft crackle of static. Then a man's voice, tired but calm, speaking about miracles and noise, about how connection was stronger than fear. She sat there long after it ended, tears in her eyes, feeling something she couldn't quite name. She wrote an article about it. It spread quietly, shared by people who had never known war, but understood what it meant to be heard. Someone uploaded the recording online. Someone else turned it into a documentary. And little by little, the hum found its way back into somewhere in the vast and endless static of modern life. The old signal carried on, faint, untraceable, but eternal. A whisper from one voice to another, passing through time like an unbroken thread. Baston line active. We're still here. If you felt that, if you understood what it means to hold on to the signal, even when the world goes silent, then don't just watch and move on. Leave your mark here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and keep listening, because every story, no matter how faint, deserves to be heard again.